little bit, you know. And the thing is, we have to be like, like when I guess when like when you enter that reality of I like, for example, when you look at the idea of like in society, people say like, okay, well, like this is a fact, right? Like this is a fact. Like people, you hear people say it all the time. They're like, so why is it a fact, right? So it's a fact because this information, has a reliable source, right? And you say like, well, okay, so what's the reliable source? Oh, well, maybe it's this newspaper. Okay, fine. This newspaper because its credibility is reliable source. So it says it. So where did the newspaper get the information from? Okay, this guy, who is a professor, right? Quote unquote, at whatever school, he wrote it. Okay, so and he's credible because he's a professor. Okay, and with the school he went to is a credible school as well, right? And so that adds to his level of stature, right? So what makes his school credible? What makes his school credible is that there is a consortium of organizations that agree that this school is credible, right? So when we talk about like the secular world, like the secular world functions on the frame of consent, right? So their whole reality, their whole factual reality is based around this concept of consent, meaning that because people agree upon it, therefore it's true, right? Or these particular people agree on it and it's particularly true. And we just like kind of like born in this reality and it's like, okay, this is true, this is not true. But that is consent. When we learn the Torah, we're learning a truth. Why? Because that truth has a source and it has a destination, right? It has a full circle, right? So the source is Hashem. That's why we quote Pasukim. That's why we quote sages. That's why because those things are all stages of building back to the ultimate source, right? The endless world, right? So everything that we are pursuing and seeking to understand is rooted in truth. But the whole world that we live in considers consent truth. But consent, nothing more, is just a collective group of people. For example, there was a time where America, only thought that black people were three-fifths of a human being. I mean, we talked about it. We talked about it, right? But that was the time, and that was the consent. And they had scientific data that proved it, psychological data that proved it, sociology studies, the whole thing. They had it, and they said that, right? So it's just to say that like the world that we live in and the information that we've been given may allow us to function from a workforce standpoint, right? But we can't allow the sustenance that comes from the money we make and the salaries and these types of things. Don't let that physical sustenance that comes along with that shelter and all these things. Don't let that. We shouldn't allow that to allow us to think that by any means are we living in the course of the potential of the world that we're living in. You know what I'm saying? And it's just like that idea because it's like you just look around, everybody's like, oh well, this fact, this statistic. But why do you believe that statistic? Oh, because the company, the organization did is really credible. So what makes them credible? Oh, because they got all these certificates and all these people and all these professors are credible. Well, how you know you professors are credible? Oh, because look at the schools they went to, right? And I think that's like the way that Rabbi Nachman is bringing of this whole concept of taking us through these phases of there being this guy, and this guy was able to like he really like had clarity. He was able to see like the endless world, right? And through prayer, right? He was a master of prayer. It explains how he obtained it. And anyways, he was able to connect with people, and he built a following, right? And his following, went out and they tried to remove pain and suffering from the world, right? And they just wanted to show people how to connect, right? Show people like, hey, you have the power to create your destiny. You have the power to heal all wounds. You have the power to, anything that you could imagine, you could do it through a relationship with Hashem, right? And you could be protected from the things that are not good for you, right? All right. So, anyways, so with that being said, um, He's got out of the shower. He's like, God, we got all this stuff in my book. It's like Israeli soap in your eyes. It's like crazy. You know what I mean? It's just what's in there, man? You know what I mean? Anyways, so yeah, so back to by Rabbi Nachman, it's like he's bringing us to that place of being able to look at reality because sometimes we look at reality from this frame of like when you think about the simplicity of spirituality, right? Like ultimately, like what does God want from us? According to the sages, what does God ultimately want? God just wants us to acknowledge that He is the source of the pleasure that we receive. That's it. It sounds like all the things, all the traditions, everything that we do is just for that reason. That every second God is providing me life, right? So I say Baruch Hashem, or if I have an apple, or if I, put on my tennis shoes, whatever it is, what I'm saying? I just want to acknowledge the creator in it. And in me doing that, I, manifest the purpose of creation. This is it. This is the halacha. This is what's the halacha by this? What's the halacha by this? What is the halacha for? That is our mechanism to remind ourselves or make that connection that what we are experiencing is from Hashem. That's it. This is the whole mechanism. It's like all these other codes, levels, spheroids, this, blah, 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 blah. For sure. You can understand it in greater detail of what's happening and how the light is moving and all those things. And there is a greater connection, for sure. But the base purpose of reality is that now what we learn, which we're learning by Rav Ashlag, you're not in that share, but you can always see it online, is, as a soul is broken up into 5 levels, 5 parts within those different worlds, there's 4 levels of desire, right? One level of desire being inanimate, rock. The level above that is plant, vegetation, and then above that is animal, and the level above that's human, right? And so as we learn different levels of the Torah, we correct those different parts of ourselves in all those different worlds. So, in the level of, say, Nefesh, right? In the level of Nefesh, there's also the rock kingdom, the plant kingdom, the animal kingdom, and human kingdom, right? All those kingdoms are within the concept of Nefesh. And the same thing by Ruach. And the same thing by Neshama and Chayin Yekida, right? So as we go up spiritually, right, we have more kavana, we have more learning, these different things. We correct these higher parts of our soul. So we do want to grow. We want to do the full job, and that's why learning, all the different things matter. But the point is being able to connect that, right? So the Rabbi Nachman stories, which are like actually originally written in Yiddish. It's a kind of funny thing because they'd be like, "Man, y'all listen to that Yiddish," But like, yeah, I mean, sometimes some good stuff written in Yiddish too. So anyway, anyways, because the point is just saying that that's the big idea, right? That's the big idea. The big idea is to be able to say like, "Hey, you know what? Um, you know what? Um, you know what? I'm here to remind myself where I came from and where all things stem from. That's it. That's the main thing. Kiddush Levana, whatever you want to say. Look at it for what it is. And when you look at it from that standpoint, now you could go deeper inside of it. You know what I'm saying? Now you could go deeper inside of the mitzvah, right? Because you're like, okay, the mitzvah is there for that. So let's go through that mechanism. Let's understand what lights I'm connecting to, what parts of the body am I feeling, right? Right? What parts of the body am I feeling, right? Because each of the mitzvahs feel a particular part of my body, right? And so, anyways, because the point is just saying that these are the levels we want to get to. We want to make it natural because some people get so caught into the religiosity of minhagim. The most simplistic part of it is just like, what are we doing? We're just reminding ourselves because you have to be able to remember that. It's like even what's the mitzvah? What's the mitzvah Shabbos? To remember, make holy, right? In terms of the Ten Commandments, right? That's the base idea, to remember that this seventh day, the light that's coming on the seventh day is coming from Hashem. So we light candles, we say Kiddush, we say Hamotzi, we have a big meal, we sing, we dance, you know, blah, 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 you know, and well, people send me rapid messages, you know what I mean? Anyways, that's the idea, right? So that's the kind of like the Kavana going into this, our great sage Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, and getting back to where we're at. Okay, so at first I didn't know where this was going, right? Because like I said, I read the story. I was first introduced to the story in one of Rabbi Arush's books, right? And so, but it wasn't the story, at least up until the point of the book that I read. So, the beauty of stories is because within the stories, it takes you through a world where you can imagine. And when you can imagine that world, that you could learn the principles and the ideas within it on a very deep level, right? So, like as we were talking about yesterday, we were saying like how his students went to a place where everybody you know, was about money, right? And the whole social society was built around money. It was built around status. It was built around who was at a higher level, all these different types of things. And because of that, the place, was filled of like, murder and theft, right? Because everything was about money and this whole thing and the different things that the community did based off of this. They moved to these isolated places and they called themselves, gods, once they achieved a certain amount of wealth, kind of like how Kanye's doing right now, right? I'm a billionaire, I'm a god, right? Same thing. This is the same thing Rabbi Nachman's talking about, right? So anyways, the kids are okay. All right. So like Shlomo Melech says, there's nothing new under the sun. Who's like, yeah, oh my God. Okay. Wait. All right, let's go back to our spot. Okay. Hold on. Gotta go back to where we left off. Okay, great. Na, 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 na. But so far, you following the story, yeah?
Yeah, I am. Yeah, it makes, I think I sent you, well, I
Yeah,
was,
yeah. The was at the those are Zohar, you said, right?
no, I think it was just, Rosh Shalom, Arusha's, in his book where I was at yesterday, it was like exactly where we were. I was like, in the same, you know what I'm
Oh,
saying?
wow, wow. Yeah, 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 yeah. I do remember that.
That's what I sent. I was like, wow, that's crazy.
Yeah, I do remember that. All right, hold on. Okay. Okay, so as we left off with so at the end we end with the Baal Tefillah, right? The master of prayer begins talking with one of the with one of them about the purpose of the world. Who is them? The people of this distant place. That money is no purpose at all, and he as is custom, but the man did not listen to him at all, and likewise the others, and likewise all of them, because they were already so lost in their mistake that they already could not listen to anyone as mentioned. And it was a wonder to the people of the city that such a man even existed and should come to them and say to them such to come to them and say such things, the complete opposite of their faith. It struck them that this man must be the must be the prayer master, because they have already heard that there is such a prayer leader in the world, since the matter of the prayer leader had already become publicized in the world. As mentioned, the people in the world would call him Defumer Bal Tefillah, the devout prayer leader. But catch him they could not, because he would make himself appear differently to each person. To one person he appeared as a merchant, to another person he appeared as a pauper, and immediately afterward disappearing, and in another words he quickly got away. So he says Vayahi hayom haya gibor. And so he says like this, and he says, okay, so the warrior, the strong man, and now it came to pass there was a mighty warrior, a Gibor, a mighty strong overpower, until whom other warriors had gathered. And now the warrior and his warriors were going around taking over countries, and the warrior wanted nothing but else but submission. In other words, that they would be subjected underneath him. And when the people of the country submitted to him, he would release them, and if not, he would ruin them. So he went around subjecting countries without any desires for money whatsoever, only submission, that they would be underneath, would they be under him. And the way of the warrior was he would send his warriors to a country when he was very still far away, even 50 miles, for them to surrender to him, and he was constantly taking over countries. Vehaso Harima Shela Mahamadina Shela Shea Asirut Hanezelo Vesha Habu Soharim. Very denute. So he says, and the merchants of the foremost wealthy country who used to conduct trade in foreign countries returned to their countries and told about the warrior and the great terror that fell upon them. And even though they were willing to submit themselves underneath him, the things that prevented them was they heard that he loathes money and he does not want any of it at all. And this was contrary to their faith. Therefore, they could not submit themselves underneath him because they could not. So you hear this crazy thing? So this one guy comes and he just wants power, right? He wants power over people. He wants them to submit to him, right? But the conflict is the people that he's going to right now are people who believe that money is everything, right? So they cannot submit to a person who has a different type of a belief. A person who doesn't value money is a person that they obviously or apparently cannot submit to, right? Such an interesting conflict. Okay, so he says they were afraid of him and they begin to perform their devotion and bring their sacrifices and their gods. That is all the money that they had, and they would take a beast, someone of little money who was considered by them a beast, and bring them for a sacrifice to their God, as mentioned. And similarly, they perform their other devotions, that is, things which they would serve gods, and the all and the warrior was continuously coming to them, and started to send this warrior ahead. What do they want? After this usual custom, as mentioned, a great terror came over them, and they did not know what to do. Veya veyasu otam anasima so harima shelachema ha heyot shehavu b'midina shechol b'nei. So he says like this, and he says, and he says, and their own merchants gave them suggestions. As much as you have been a country where the entire populace were gods and traveled about with angels, that is, that country is where everyone from the smallest to the greatest are all extraordinarily great. He says wealthy people in extreme, such that even the smallest among them is also a god according to their foolishness and delusion. Because the smallest person in the country is exceptionally wealthy and has and as much money as was reckoned by them, that was that with that much money one becomes a god, as mentioned. And they travel with angels, since their horses are covered with such great wealth, the gold and so forth, that the coverings of one horse was worth the amount of of that of an angel had. He says, thus the riders travel with angels, tying three pairs of angels to a carriage and riding with them. And therefore, you need to send this to the country, and they will surely help you. For all the guys, which was still the active of their merchants, they advised, please, they advised, they their advice pleased them very much, and they believed that they would surely be saved by the country since they were all gods, as mentioned. Okay, so you got to just the plot. Ve ha'abal tefillah. So the Baal tefillah, and he says the master prayer came to a decision that he would once again go to that country, and perhaps he will be able to lead them out of their folly. And he went there and came up to the guards and began speaking with one of the guards in the usual way. The guards told him about the warrior, and they are a great terror to him. And the prayer master asked him, what do you have in mind? The guard told him the matter of the mentioned above, and that they wanted to send to the country where they were all gods. וישכח ממנו מאוד הבעל תפילה ואמרו לי. I'm sorry, Amar Lo. So he says, and the Baltafila made much laughter of him and said, it that is quite a great folly because there are humans like we are, and we are all we and all of you with all of your guts. Okay, so he's basically saying that the guy. Okay, so this is the thing. So first he went to this town before, right? And he went to this town and he went and he tried to talk to everybody about basically, the creator. And they basically didn't want to hear him. Why? Because they were very wealthy and they had this whole thing that they were at this high level, and they were disconnected from other human beings, and they lived in this kind of like private society and this whole thing, and they didn't want to hear what he had to say, right? So the ball tefillah, he decides he comes back and he wants to do the same thing. So he talks to the guard. He talks to the guard, and the guard starts telling him about these gods that are, I mean, these warriors that are coming, and the whole situation on how they can't submit to them because they have a different belief, and they have this power and this, right? It is blah blah blah. And so the ball tefillah is listening to this, and he just starts laughing at him, right? And he says that is quite a great folly because you are humans like we are, and all of you with all of your gods are all merely humans, and not one of them is any god at all. There's no other than one God in the world, and he created everything, and alone he should be served, and only to him he should pray, and this alone is the main purpose in the world. And such words did the prayer master speak with the guard, and the prayer master kept speaking more. He said, and the prayer kept speaking more of the same kind of words to the guard, while the guard continued not to listen because their mistaken belief had already been set within the iron, has been set within from a long time, as mentioned. Afa pi kin haba al tefila Tarba alav devarim ad she basof heshiv lo. So he says like this. However, the prayer leader debated with him extensively. Finally, until the guard answered him and says, "What else can I do?" He says, I'm only one individual after all. Compared to me are the numerous residents of the country. Now, he says, after he admitted this, he says, now he already had the semblance of some type of tshuva. He said he repented in a way. As the words of the words of as the Baal Tefillah had spoken before with the guard, and the words that he spoke now joined. And he says together, that's a very interesting thing. So he's saying he went to him and he spoke to him and it didn't connect. And then he came back again and he spoke, and then now what he's saying now allowed him to connect to what was said before. That's also a very secret code in there. So he says the leader spoke before, he says this leader has spoken with him before, and the words he spoke now join with together what he spoke is now joined what he's now spoke joined together. They stirred him somewhat. So it's two, light and vessel, right? So maybe the initial speaking is light, and the second speaking is vessel. He said, because the tefillah that the guard had answered, "What can I do?" made it known that the words of the prayer leader were started we're starting to already enter his heart a little bit. So you want to speak to people's hearts. Bekin chalech be'ala tefila ala ha shomer ha sheni divrei imo gam kin. So he says, and so the prayer leader went to the other guard, and he spoke with him in his usual way as above, and he did not listen to him, but in the end, he also replied as above, I am only one person, and so forth as above. And all the guards answered him this tshuva at the end. So he says the fact that the fact that they didn't say they wanted to make a change, but the fact that they accepted that they were just people, right? Because before they were holding like at this like supreme level and at this high level, this this whole thing. And so he says, so after he talked to him about life in the real, he said the fact that they were able to just admit that they weren't gods was a huge thing. And the fact that they said that I'm just a person. So he's showing us this process of how change happens, right? He's saying like, okay, don't go in and just think you're going to change someone's mind. Don't just think you're going to go in and bring ideas. It's like, no, you got to go in stages, right? You got to bring the light, you got to bring the vessel. And then when those things connect, then there's a process of connecting to one's heart. And then from there, there's a process of some bit of recognition, which is the big change. So it says, Akarecha nikanas ha'aba'al tefila al ha'ir tehikil shuv lidaber imam. So he says, and he says, afterwards, the prayer leader entered the city and he began talking with them in his usual way, as much as they are all very much in the complete error, and money is no goal at all. Rather, the essential purpose to soul is to dwell into the Torah, into the prayer, and so forth. And they did not listen to him, for they were all very rooted in money, and for a long time. And they told him about the warriors, and they want to send the country. They want to send to the country where all the gods are. He laughed at them, and he laughed at them too, and told them that it was a folly, and that they are only humans, and that they will be unable to help you at all. And because so he's saying like all these people he's talking to basically wanted to reach the level where they wanted to reach the level of the gods, the people of the super wealthy, the exclusive, the ones who live away in the mountains and they were all protected by guards. The people that live there wanted to ascend to that level, right? And they did not listen to him. And he said, and they told him about the warriors, right? So these people, they lived in this place, this town where everybody was obsessed with money. Everybody had, this type of thing, and they were, and everyone wanted it, and everyone's value was based off of how much money that they had, and they had to show how much money they had. Very similar that we have with fashion, right? It's like the type of shoes you're wearing, this all determines that, and then where you work at, how much money you make. Same exact thing. He said, but there was a super class that lived amongst them, and they lived tucked away. They lived high in the mountains, like even like above the clouds. And they built these massive homes there. And they called themselves gods because they were the ones who accumulated the most wealth. And you couldn't even get into this community unless you achieved a certain level of wealth, right? And so when the master of prayer comes in there, they're saying this whole thing about their whole aspiration is that they want to be able to reach the gods. He said because that's where everything is good and everything is good in your life. And so he laughed at him. He said, "You guys are kidding yourself. What are you talking about? These people are only humans. They can't do anything for you at all, or their status." He says, because you are all humans and they are humans, they are no gods whatsoever. He says, there is only one God, blessed be He. And the warriors reply, and as for the warriors. So the people also talk about the warriors. And he says, as for the warriors, he replied to them with the wondering expressions, isn't this that warrior? He says, he says, in the one he knows. He says they did not understand what he meant. And so he went from one to the other and continued talking thus with them as above. And as for the warrior, he said to everyone, isn't this that warrior as above? He said he did not understand this words, what he meant. He said, Ve na'aseh ra'ash be'ir, be asher v'nim echad midaber. He says, meanwhile, I can, oof, a commotion broke out in the city, as much as they were found someone who said the such things, making laughter of their faith. So like it's kind of like a Sodom Gomorrah type of situation almost, right? And he says, in saying that there is only one single entity, Hashem, blessed be He, and as for the warriors, I was always saying, isn't this that warrior as above? And they understood that this must be certainly be the master of prayer because he had already notorious among them as mentioned in order for him to be sought and caught even though he appeared different each time, that is at the time presenting himself as a merchant, at the time as a poor person, and so forth, whenever they were not able to catch him as mentioned. Nevertheless they knew of this too, that the prayer leader constantly presented himself directly, the order and investigation into him for him to be captured. For he was sought out until he called him, and they brought him to the elders. So they got him, they caught him. So he says, "Ve'hi kilu lidaber imam ve'amer ve'lechem gam ken." So and when they began talking to him, he told them as also as above, you are all mistaken in a great folly, and there's no purpose whatsoever, and all that money is no good at all. And he says, and he says, instead their existence a similar, all blessed name, blessed the Holy Creator, blessed be His name, who has created everything. He alone should be served, and the money is a utter nonsense. In the country where you say all, in the country where you say all, they're all gods, they are unable to help you whatsoever, for they are only human. Vena cheshav asmal es I'm sorry es eslam es Islam, and it says Lishamu God, Aki Ko, Bine Hamadina. So he says, and they considered him insane because the entire country was already so immersed in money that they are already so crazed that whoever said something contrary to the foolishness was for them a madman. This is crazy, right? So he says, okay, so we're going to the next one. Just keeps going. It says, "Ve'sha'elu oto maze she'ata omer al inaina legibor." So he says like this. So the king's hands, right? The king's hands is what we're talking about. The king and the hand, the king and the hand. Okay, that's interesting. So he says they asked him, "What is this?" So it's a continuation. He says they asked him, "What is it that you say about the warriors? Isn't this that warrior as above?" He answered them, "As much as I used to be with a king, and to the king a warrior was lost. Then if this is what a war," he says, if and he says, "then if this is what warrior I'm acquainted with him, and furthermore, relying on the contrary, where you say they are all gods. This is nonsense because they are unable to help you whatsoever. Just the reverse. This will be your very downfall if you rely on them." And they asked him, "Where do you know this from?" He says, "Ha shiv lakem heyot." So he tells them this. So he basically tells these people like basically all these truths, right? They bring him in front of the elders, and he just keeps on the same message. He says, "You know what? You guys are living in error This is not the right thing. And they said, okay, fine. So what are you saying about these warriors, right? And and he tells him, he says, this whole idea that you guys want to rely on these gods that you think are going to protect you, these wealthy people, and this whole thing, that's not going to happen either, right? And I used to be with the king, and to the king a warrior it was lost. And then if this is this is just then if this is what warrior I'm I am acquainted with him, and furthermore relying. So I think he's saying that he knows this guy, the main warrior guy, the main like big warrior guy. I think this is what he's saying. And furthermore, you're relying on the country where you say they're gods. This is nonsense because they are unable to help you whatsoever. So I guess he's negotiating with them, like showing them, like, hey, the guy who's coming, I know this guy, and the people who you think are going to help you not. So just the reverse, this will be your very downfall if you rely on them. For they, for he says, they asked him, where do you know this from? So they're saying, where are you getting this information that we should trust you? This is going to happen, and this warrior, you'll be able to persuade him or connect to him in some type of way. He says, Heshiv lachem hayod she'atel melech haniel shehu haya atzlo. So he says like this, and he says that, and he answered them. He says, as far as the king whom he was with, he says, with him a hand. That is, the king had something resembling a hand with 5 fingers. So this king had some type of device that looked like a hand and had 5 fingers. And with the groves, he says that is all the creases in the ruts that are on the hand, and the hand was a map of all the worlds and all that was seen since creation of the heavens and the earth until the end that will be afterwards, with all depictions in the hand. So he says all the events, everything that ever exists was inside the hands, and it was coded inside the crevices and the lines in the hand. And he says, for deception in the scarce and the folds of the hand was the diagram of all the worlds, and how every world stands. And he says, and with all every he says, with all of every world's things and details, everything standing out on the depictions of the land. All right, just let me make sure. And he says for he says de, depicted in the scratches and the folds of the hand was a diagram of all the worlds, right? And how the world stands with all the world's things in detail, everything standing out on and as depicted on the land map, as as I known a to those who are used to the land map that is depicted on a paper is each town, every country, and every bridge. And similarly, everything screams woods. And by everything, all is written down. And that is to this town. That is that the country and so forth. Kemo can mamash haya niyasam beri to tech. So he says, thus the worlds were depicted on the hands and by the ruts and the folds of the hand, and the hands ruts were as if letters, just as the letters were inscribed on the map next to each thing, so that he may know what it is. That is what he should know, that here is this town and there is this stream, and likewise and other things. In exactly the same way, by the ruts of the hands were depicted the likeness of letters next to everything depicted on the hands, so as to know what everything is depicted there. The same for everything separate, cities, towns, rivers, bridges, mountains, everything, whatever is found in the world and in all the worlds, everything was depicted on this hand. Could you imagine? There's this hand that just had literally the roadmap and the grid of everything that was created, is created, and will be created, right? And they were all. He said they were, and they were always letters standing next to everything. And he says, and thus, and he says, and this is the same. This is the this. He said, and this is, and he says, and that this is this thing, and this is that thing. Similarly, all the people who go around in every country and all the experiences that is experienced that passed over a man during his lifetime were all depicted on this hand. Vehaya Kiti, this is a serious hand, no? Sham Gam Ko Haderukim. And we think we know the scope of technology has existed throughout the ages. He says, and even all the paths from the country to others and from one place to another were written on it, on an account of I knew the ways to come here to this town, which no man can enter, because the wealthy country had dug around their cities, and nobody could uh, get to them above and so forth. So he's saying, I use this knowledge, this technology, to get inside this area because the way it's fortified, no one could get in. And so if you want to send me into the other town, I know that way too. Although the hand, although the hand and is also imprinted on the hand was the way from one world into another world. He says, for there is a path and a course on which one can ascend from the earth to the heavens. For one cannot go up from the earth to the heavens due to not knowing the way. But depicted there was the way to go up to heaven. So depicted there were all the paths that exist from one world to another world. For Eliyahu ascended to heaven with his path, and the path was written there. Moshe Rabbeinu went up to heaven with a different path, and that other path was also written there. Likewise, Enoch ascended to heaven on another path, and that path was also written there. Thus, from one world to the other, the farther, the higher the world was all depicted by the ruts in the folds of the hand. Gam haya near some kol hayad kol ba the daver ve daver kifi. So he says also represented on the hand was everything that was at the time the world was created. As for now, and as for now, and as it will be afterwards. For instance, Sodom was depicted. Ooh, Sodom. So wait, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about a hand? Or what are we talking about? So he said Sodom was depicted there as the city had been while inhabited before it was overturned. In addition, depicted there was Sodom being upheaved as the city turned over again. Depicted there was Sodom as it appears today after the upheaval. And on the hand was depicted. So it's two levels. He said, so it was appeared was Sodom was depicted on the hand before, and then it shows it being overturned, right? And then the third one was where it is today. So, right, so that's the system there. So he says, and on the hand it was depicted was what was and what is and what will be. In the hand I have seen the country of which you say there are all gods together with all the people who come to them for help. That is, the city should help them. Both of all be obliterated. And for all of the prayers of, he says, all of this prayers leaders told them. He says, Ve'na fila be'enehem be daver me'od ki havu lenikarim divrei emet ki ze yadua. So he says this was an extraordinary novelty to them. He says extraordinary novelty to them. For it they recognized that this was true talk because it is known on the map that all things are depicted. So they were understood that his words are true, since the things uh, uh, cannot be thought up, because one can see for himself that he can put together two rods of the hand, and a letter will become of them. For this reason, they understood this is not a contrived thing. Hence, it was an extraordinary novelty to them. This, he says, they asked him, and he said, and now they asked him this: whereabouts is this king? Perhaps he will show us how perhaps he will show us a way of how to find money. And he says, Hashi. So he says, he answers them back, Edin, Atema Roti Maimon. So he says, and he answered them with an expression of obstructing anger. You still want money? Don't talk about money. He says, don't talk about money at all. They asked him, nevertheless, tell us where the king is. He answered them, I too don't know of the king where he is. And this is how the story happened. Okay, so now we're about to start a whole other thing. So all this is the beginning of this story. I guess they find the king, right? Vehaya melech malacha vehaya lachem bet yechida. Okay, so he says the prayer leader tells the city about the king. Once they're this is unbelievable though. They hand this the king and the whole thing. They believed him because of the book. So because of the hand that got all the secrets. He says once there was a king and a queen, and they had only one daughter, and it came near a time to marry her off. So they seated the advisors to give counsel to whom she should be married off to. And I too, that is the prayer leader who is still relating this in front of them. So he's explaining the story about how I guess how he met this whole situation. He says, was there among the advisors because the king likened me. And my advice was that he should give her the warrior, because the warrior had wart us with us many benefits, for he had conquered many territories, and therefore he ought to be given the queen's daughter for a wife. My advice was likened that they all agree upon it, and there was a big celebration there for found a groom for a queen's dinner, and they wed the queen. And okay, so he said okay, fine. So my advice was likened, and they all agreed upon it, and there was a big celebration for all having the groom for found a groom of the queen's daughter, and they wed the queen's daughter with the warrior, and the queen's daughter had a child, and the baby was quite astonishingly beautiful, and he had very golden he had golden skin in his face, and he was like the sun, and his eyes were other luminaries, and the child was born with a mature wisdom, because they saw in him immediately that when he was born, that he was in already a great sage. For when the people were talking in the place where one needs to laugh, he would laugh. And so when the others with others such things like likewise recognized him of being a great sage, except not having the motions of an adult. Namely, he had not yet did not have the faculty of speech, and other such things. But this way, but this they saw right away, that he is already a big genius. Ve'hatzel hamalek melik say lemech. He says ve'hanenu di baran ba'al leshon. So he says, and the king and the queen, and the king was an orator, that is a speaker, who was a master of language and rhetoric, and who was able to talk a very fine talk, very beautiful speech, songs, and praises for the king. And the orator was the orator was on his own account of a fine order too, but the king showed him the hidden paths and the ways for him to go up, and to get the power to of the science of rhetoric, and thereby he became a super orator. The king had also had a sage, and the sage was also a sage on his own account. But the king showed him the ways to go up higher and get wisdom, and thereby he became exemplary and extraordinary, superb sage. He says, "Vekin hagibor haya gibor ma'asmot behamelech yira'e lo derek ein ya'ale v'kabel gibura ve'al yedei zeh." So he says, and stumbling, he said, and similarly, the warrior was mighty on his own, but the king showed him the way on for him to go up and get strength, and thereby become an extraordinary, superb warrior. And for there is a sword that hangs in the air, and the sword has three powers. When the sword was lifted, when all the officers of the opposite army fleed, so as a matter of the course they have fallen, because when the officers fled, there was no one to lead the battle. So they certainly fell. But despite this, the survivors, despite this, the survivors may still be able to wage war. However, the sword has two sharp edges, and they have two powers through one edge, and all the downfall, and through the other's edge, they get sick, called wasting and consumption, fighting the enemies of who they are fighting. So this just understand what's going on. Okay. So he was able to, this warrior guy was able to achieve. So he's giving them the whole backstory on how things became who they are, right? And so basically, this warrior marries this king's daughter, and the king and him become close. And he was already a great warrior, but the king had this ability to show people how to go higher, how to tap into a higher level of connection, and from there he became powerful, right? All right, and he says so he had this power that when he would get close to places, people just knew he was coming, and people would just run, they would leave, this whole thing, right? So he says, so he says, so he said, so by merely making a move with his sword in a place, the enemies were stricken with the foremost things, that is, by using the edge. So this sword gave him this superpower that, like, just moving it, like, terrified people. He didn't even have to go to war. And by using one's edges, the enemies have defeated. And by using another edge, the enemies were stricken with the door, as mentioned before. He said the king showed the warrior the path that is to use is that there is the sword, and from there he obtained great strength. Vegam ani, he says here, li Amelech, Derek. So and to me the king also showed the way to get my things. I got from there what I need. In other words, in other words, a prayer leader who is telling all this says that the king showed him the way from which he should get this thing, namely prayer. So he's saying the same king showed. He said the king also showed the way to get my thing. And I got from there what I needed. In other words, the king of the prayer, the master prayer tells him that the king showed him the way, that how he should reach his unique thing, which was prayer. That he showed him how to do at the highest level. V'ken haya hamelech ohev ne'aman shehaya hoshev. So he says, and likewise the king had a faithful he says, and likewise, the king had a faithful friend, a faithful one who loved. In other words, a good trustworthy friend, right? Who is with the king. They're saying some words in English. I don't know. So he says, and he says, who loved him, who loved himself with the king, with an extraordinary love, and they loved each other so much that it was utterly impossible for them to see with to be for them to be without seeing one another for an amount of time. But nonetheless, there must be times where they needed to be apart, so that they portray in which both of their images are depicted, and they would delight themselves. In other words, they would take pleasure in the satisfaction with the portrait when they could not see each other. And the image depicts how the king and his faithful friend love each other and kiss each other with great love. And the portraits had the special ability that whomever looked at the image obtained great love. In other words, one who received the trait of love when looking at the image, and the faithful friend also received the love that is enormous from the place in which the king showed him. Okay, so they're talking about this great love between the king and his friend, right? And we got to realize all these things have very deep meanings, right? Vehigia et shekhalahu ko. So he says, and it came time when they all went each one to his place to receive the power of this thing. And he says that the orator, the warrior, and the king's people each went up to his place and to renew his power. And it could be Rosh Hashanah, no? And he says, and then the day came to pass, and there was a very great storm upon the world, and the storm mixed up the whole entire world, and overturned seas, lands, and dry lands, and seas and wilderness to settled areas, and settled areas to wilderness, and so it overturned the entire world. And the storm wind went into the king's chamber and did nothing at all there. In other words, there was a king's. It woefully, absolutely did no damage, except that the windstorms ended. I mean, went in and snatched away the child of the queen's daughter, right? The kid who was special. So he says, in the midst of the commotion, as the storm. So this storm went. There's a storm that came, and if you can imagine, this storm rearranged the world. It took some parts of the world that were in one part of the world and moved it from one part of the world to the other. It moves seas, it moves rivers, it moves all these things. And when this wind reached the king's palace, it didn't do anything except for it snatched this young child. And so he said he snatched away this dear child, and the king and he says, and the king's daughter followed immediately. In other hands, the princess immediately started running after the child in order to snatch him back. She went off to some place, and no one knows where. And so to the queen, and so did the king, and they all went after the child until they all became dispersed, and no one knows where they are. But all of us were nowhere nearby during this. We were gone away, and then each to a place to renew his power, as mentioned. And he says, and when we came back, we could no longer find them, as mentioned. And he said the hand too became missing, then too as well. Wow, this is crazy. So he says, Tihi Paziru Kul. He says, Kulanu Umeaz Ein Lanu Yekulim Od. So he says, from time to time on, we have all become scattered, and can no longer each go to his place to renew his power. He says, for since the entire world has been overturned, and now we need to different paths. And he says, and now we need different paths today. Therefore, we have no longer gone up to each other to this place to renew the power. However, the impression that remains by each of us, meaning the token that is the bit, the little bit that has remained by each one for a year long is also very great and is also mighty, which is the country feared. And the king's warrior, he certainly is a very mighty warrior. And for all of the prayers, and this is all the things that the prayer master told them. He says Veheshev Shema'u Dever. He says Deverav, and he says and he heard out of his words that they were very amazed, and so what they heard from his words they were very amazed, and now they held prayer fast by him, and would no longer let him go from them, because perhaps the warriors upon them is the king's warrior mentioned above, with whom the prayer is acquainted. Veha gibor veha nazahaya holech umita karav. So he says. So okay. So we could stop here. I got because on Wednesday it's a little bit shorter, as you know. But we could continue on tonight if you want, because I'm pretty sure Wednesday night. Um, I won't be doing. I don't think I'll be doing Rock of Zion this week.
Okay.
So we could probably have I probably overtime. But any thoughts, reflections?
I can tell this is yeah, this is deep. How he's putting it's deeper than what it seems on the shot. Like he's talking some heavy. Like when he was talking about the sword and like the three columns, it's like, oh, hold on. You know what I mean? Because it kind of reminded me of Nimrod, like when he had the cloak of he had the clothes of Adam, and how he put these on and he was able to conquer the whole world. And this fourth, and it's like I'm just hearing these things. I'm like, no, this is much deeper than what it's like the hand and yeah, it's deeper than what it lets on. It's very Kabbalistic, I feel like. So it's like encoded. So I'm curious to kind of go back and break it down a little bit and see like what all these metaphors are.
Yeah, no, it's real. Okay, so let's continue later. Is that
Hmm.
cool?
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll continue later, and I want to see if we can at least finish the story. I mean, the thing keeps going, bro. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, it was like it's like a book.
Yeah, let's finish it up.
Yeah, we finish it up, and we'll finish up. We'll see whatever it takes us. But then we have our schedule. I mean, we're there, but it's good to take break. It's good it's good to exercise other parts of your brain. You know what I'm saying? Because a lot of the stuff we were doing was very left brain, very mechanical, very technical. You know what I mean? So you need a God to stretch out the other part of the brain, right? Which is the right brain, the more imaginative, the more creative. These things. So the stories allow us to get there. Anyways, sorry. So this evening I went